15 points vs 10 points. The most lopsided ceasefire in modern history. Did Iran just win? April 8th, 2026. A day that will be studied in diplomatic academies for decades, not because the fighting stopped, but because of how it stopped. After 40 days of brutal warfare, after 11,000 American strikes, after hundreds of Israeli sorties, after thousands of Iranian missiles rained down on the Gulf states of the United States, and Iran agreed to a 2-week ceasefire. But here's the thing about this ceasefire. It wasn't negotiated in Geneva. Not in Vienna. Not in some sterile diplomatic conference room with translators and lawyers. It was hammered out through Pakistan, with China pulling strings behind the scenes. And when the terms finally emerged, the world saw something unprecedented. 2 documents. 15 points from the United States, 10 points from Iran. Not an agreement, not a consensus. Just 2 lists. Sitting on the same table, with nobody agreeing on what they actually meant. President Donald Trump called it a workable basis for talks. Iran's military called it a surrender by the United States. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he wasn't even consulted, properly finding out about the deal at the last minute. Reportedly furious, and within 24 hours, Israeli warplanes were bombing Beirut. Iranian drones were striking Saudi pipelines. Kuwaiti power plants were on fire. The ceasefire wasn't collapsing. It had never really stood up in the first place. So today, we're going to do something simple. We're going to put these 2 documents side by side, 15 American points versus 10 Iranian points, and ask the question everyone is whispering. Who actually won this thing? Let's find out. Chapter 1, the American 15 points. What Washington wanted. Let me start with the American proposal. According to multiple reports from the Jerusalem Post, News 18, and the Daily Excelsior, the U.S. 15-point plan had several core demands. Here's what Washington wanted. First, Iran's nuclear program had to go. The U.S. demanded an end to Iran's uranium enrichment. Not a pause. Not limits. An end. They also wanted Iran to hand over its stockpile of enriched uranium, more than 400 kilograms, that had been the subject of international concern for years. Second, Iran's missile program had to be gutted. The U.S. wanted strict limits on Iran's ballistic missile program. Remember, these were the same missiles that had been striking Israel, UAE, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia for weeks. Washington wanted that threat eliminated. Third, Iran had to cut ties with its proxies, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, the militias in Iraq and Syria. The U.S. wanted Tehran to stop supporting these groups. Fourth, the Strait of Hormuz had to be fully reopened. Iran had been controlling the strait, charging fees, inspecting ships, limiting passage. The U.S. wanted free navigation for international trade. No questions asked. Fifth, and this is where it gets tricky, the American proposal was reportedly a take-it-or-leave-it framework. No negotiation, no compromise. These were the terms. Trump had been threatening the Stone Age for weeks. He had promised to end 3,000 years of Iranian civilization. This was his offer. And Iran's response? They didn't just say no. They came back with their own document. 10 points. And this is where the story gets really interesting. Chapter 2, the Iranian 10 points. Tehran's counterpunch. The Iranian response was not a negotiation. It was a rebuke. According to Iranian state media IRNA, the Daily Excelsior, and Middle East Eye, Iran's 10-point plan included demands that directly contradicted almost every American objective. Let me walk you through them. Point 1. No more uranium enrichment limits. Actually, the opposite. Iran demanded acceptance of its uranium enrichment for what it called a peaceful nuclear program. In other words, we're keeping our centrifuges, deal with it. Point to the Strait of Hormuz stays under Iranian control. Iran wasn't just demanding to keep the strait. They wanted to formalize their new system of charging fees. According to the New York Times, Iran proposed a fee of approximately $2 million per ship to be shared with Oman. Point 3. All sanctions must be lifted, not just the wartime sanctions, not just the nuclear sanctions, all of them. Primary and secondary. Every restriction on Iran's economy, gone. Point forward compensation for war damage. Iran demanded that the United States pay for the destruction caused by American and Israeli bombs. Infrastructure, military facilities, civilian buildings, all of it. Point 5. The release of frozen assets. Billions of dollars of Iranian money, frozen in foreign banks for years. Iran wanted it all back. Point 6. A binding pledge of no future attacks. This wasn't just a ceasefire. Iran wanted a legally binding commitment that the US and Israel would never strike them again. Point 7. Withdrawal of all US combat forces from the region, not just from Iran, from the entire Middle East. Every American soldier, sailor, airman, and marine gone. Point 8. An end to attacks on allies. This meant Lebanon. This meant Yemen. Iran demanded that Israeli strikes on Hezbollah stop immediately. Point 9. Reconstruction guarantees. Iran wanted international commitments and funding to rebuild what had been destroyed. Point 10. A definitive end to the conflict, not a pause. Iran refused to accept a temporary ceasefire. They wanted a permanent end to the war. No more 2 weeks. No more extensions. Finished. Now, let's pause here for a moment. If you're scoring at home, here's what just happened. The United States demanded that Iran surrender its nuclear program, its missile program, its proxies, and its control over the strait. Iran responded by demanding that the United States surrender its sanctions, its troops, its allies, and its right to ever attack again. These two documents are not just different. They are mirror images of rejection. Chapter 3. The Lebanon loophole. The contradiction that broke everything, but here's where the ceasefire becomes not just lopsided, but absurd. The Iranian proposal explicitly stated that the ceasefire must apply to Lebanon. No strikes on Hezbollah. No bombing of Beirut. No Israeli operations in the south. Iran's president, Masoud Pezeshkian, personally called French President Emmanuel Macron. Emmanuel Macron. To make this clear, he said, halting Israeli strikes on Lebanon was among the 10 conditions attached to the agreement. Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharifta Mediatore publicly stated that the ceasefire included Lebanon. But then, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu went on television and said something completely different. Lebanon was not included, he declared. That's a separate skirmish. Vice President J.D. Vance backed him up. Lebanon is not part of the ceasefire agreement, he said. And to prove it, Israel launched more than 100 airstrikes across Lebanon within hours of the ceasefire announcement. More than 250 people were killed. Over 1,100 were injured. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Entire buildings in central Beirut were reduced to rubble. So let me ask you a question. If one side says the ceasefire includes Lebanon, and the other side says it doesn't and then proceeds to bomb Lebanon, is there actually a ceasefire? The answer, of course, is no. There is a fiction of a ceasefire. A diplomatic fig leaf. A pause in one theater of war while another theater burns. And this brings us to the central question of our episode. Chapter 4. The scorecard. Who actually won? Let's put aside the propaganda. Let's put aside the spin. Let's look at what actually happened and what each side actually got. What the United States got. The US got a pause in direct Iranian attacks on American forces in the Gulf. For 2 weeks, at least. That's something. They also got the Strait of Hormuz partially reopened. Ships started moving again. Oil prices, which had spiked to over $100 per barrel, began to stabilize. And they got time. Time to resupply. Time to reposition. Time to figure out what comes next. But here's what the US did not get. They did not get Iran's nuclear program. The centrifuges are still spinning. The enriched uranium is still there, more than 400 kilograms, unaccounted for. They did not get Iran's missile program. Iran continued firing missiles throughout the first week of the ceasefire. They did not get an end to Iranian control over the Strait of Hormuz. In fact, the opposite happened. The ceasefire effectively formalized Iran's authority to charge fees and manage passage. And most importantly, they did not get a surrender. Iran is still standing. The regime is still in power. The supreme leader who was killed in the first week of the war. Iran found a new one. The system adapted. What Iran got something far more valuable than territory or weapons. They got legitimacy. Think about this. Before the war, the United States refused to negotiate with Iran directly. Sanctions were the tool. Pressure was the strategy. Now, the US is sitting across the table from Iranian diplomats in Islamabad. Pakistan is mediating. China is pulling strings. That's a diplomatic victory. Whether Washington admits it or not, Iran also got recognition of its control over the Strait of Hormuz. The ceasefire agreement, as interpreted by Tehran, explicitly acknowledges Iran's authority to coordinate passage via coordination with Iran's armed forces, and they got something else. Proof that the United States cannot destroy them from the air. Raphael Ben-Levi of the Moscow Institute put it this way: the military phase accomplished the significant degrading of Iran's threat capabilities, especially its missile forces, 90% of which has been taken offline, but 90% is not 100%, and as long as Iran can still launch missiles as they did throughout the first week of the ceasefire, they have not lost. As one analyst told The Economist, quoted by the Daily Excelsior, if the negotiations lead to a deal, and Iran agrees to end its regional aggression in exchange for relief from American sanctions, both would arguably win. If they fail and the war resumes, both might lose. But here's the catch. Iran's demands, 10 points, are almost all still on the table. Sanctions, relief, asset release, reconstruction, a binding pledge of no future attacks. The US has not agreed to any of them. So who won? Chapter 5. The Netanyahu factor. The ally who was left in the dark. We cannot understand this ceasefire without understanding one crucial player: Israel. According to Reuters and the Wall Street Journal, Israel opposed reaching a ceasefire deal with Iran. They believed continued military pressure could further weaken Tehran's leadership. Israeli officials were reportedly unhappy with the limited consultation and late notice before the US announced the agreement. They found out at the last minute through a phone call between Trump and Netanyahu shortly before the announcement. And when they saw the terms, they objected, especially to any suggestion that the truce extended to Lebanon, which, as we've seen, became the central contradiction of the entire agreement. David Hurst, writing for Middle East Eye, put it bluntly: Netanyahu was the man who led Trump into this war. If the war goes wrong, he is the man upon whose shoulders the entire Washington establishment will place the blame. And from Israel's perspective, the war hasn't gone right. Iran is still standing. Hezbollah is still firing rockets. The nuclear program is still intact. What Israel wanted, Rahim Eshande, or at least the complete destruction of Iran's military capabilities, did not happen. And now, Israel finds itself in a strange position. The United States seats closest to negotiated a ceasefire without fully consulting them. The ceasefire does not apply to Lebanon both. Iran is demanding that it does. And Israel's 2-week window to go as hard as it wants. And Lebanon may close sooner than expected. So who won? Certainly not Netanyahu. Chapter 6. The Fragile Reality. What actually happens next? Let me close with a dose of reality. This ceasefire is not peace. Nobody thinks it is. Raphael Ben-Levi said it best. This is just a ceasefire in the sense that it's not peace. The terms are not set, yet not on the Strait of Hormuz, not on the nuclear issue, and not on Lebanon. So what happens next? Scenario 1. The talks succeed. Iran gets sanctions relief and asset releases. The US gets some limits on Iran's nuclear program, though probably not the complete surrender Washington originally demanded. The Strait of Hormuz stays under Iranian management, but shipping resumes. Lebanon remains a problem, but talks continue. Scenario 2. The talks fail. Iran closes the strait again. Oil prices spike again. The bombing resumes, and the world is back where it started, only with more death, more destruction, and less trust. Scenario 3. There's low bleed. The ceasefire holds on paper, but violations continue. Israel keeps striking Lebanon. Iran keeps launching drones at the Gulf states. The US keeps bombing Iranian targets it claims are defensive. And nobody officially breaks the truce because nobody wants to be blamed for restarting the war. Which scenario is most likely? If I had to bet, I'd put my money on number 3. Because in the Middle East, ceasefires are never endings. They're just intermissions. Closing, so did Iran win? Let me answer the question I posed at the beginning. Did Iran win? Not in the way you might think. Tehran didn't conquer Jerusalem. Didn't destroy the American fleet. Didn't drive the US out of the Middle East. But here's what Iran did do. He survived. They survived. They forced the United States with all its firepower, all its technology, all its allies to sit across the table and negotiate. They kept their nuclear program. They kept their missile program. They kept their control over the Strait of Hormuz. And they watched as their enemies closest to Israel was left out of the loop, furious and frustrated. That's not a military victory. But in the strange calculus of Middle Eastern politics, it might be something close. As one Iranian military statement put it, extremely heavy losses and casualties were inflicted, showing that Iran can put any enemy in place and force them to surrender and retreat. The US would never use the word surrender, but the fact that the bombing stopped on Iran's terms, with Iran's demands still on the table, speaks for itself. 15 points versus 10 points. On paper, it's a mismatch. In reality, the shorter list may have won. This is Geopolitics and Markets. If you want to see the world not from the headlines, but from what's hidden beneath them, you know where to go. See you in the next episode.